are in listen-only mode.
Good morning from the Pathways to Positive Futures Research and Training Center. This is Eileen Brennan. Welcome you on behalf of our staff. First, before we begin, a few ideas about how to best use GoToWebinar. Please remove any electronic handheld devices away from your computers and speakers. They tend to interfere and they may disrupt your ability to hear. The second thing that we recommend is that you close all file sharing applications and streaming music or video. Please shut down Spotify or any of those kinds of apps. Please check your settings on the audio panel if you're experiencing audio problems. So just look at your own machine, look at that audio panel, and change the volume until it's at a volume that you like. During the presentation, you can send questions to the webinar organizer, but we're going to hold these until the end after the presentations are finished. And you will not be able to speak during the call because of the number of attendees today. So if you would like to see this webinar later, there will be a recording of it and a PDF of the presentation available online at our website. So next, let's talk about the topic, recovery on campus. Today's webinar is focused on supporting young adults with mental health difficulties in the post-secondary education setting. And we're very fortunate to have two presenters today who have lots of experience working on campus, Susan Shapiro and Devin Fox. Susan Shapiro is the Director of Student Disability Services at the University of Pennsylvania. And Devin Fox is a young person who is the Executive Director of Young People in Recovery and who's had experience receiving support on campus, in campuses in which he went to school. Today's education webinar objectives are to discuss trends in college attendance and the importance of college for emerging adults, to explain the challenges of living away from home while going to school and being in recovery, to understand the relevance of the law and documentation guidelines, and describe the process of disclosure and that of obtaining accommodations on campus, and finally to understand the factors promoting success, including resources and social support that you can obtain on campus. So we'll first turn to Susan Shapiro, who's the Director of Student Disability Services at Penn. Good morning, Susan.
Good morning, everyone. I'd like to talk a little bit to begin with about the trends that we're seeing in higher education. Over the past several years, we've seen generally large increases in students with disabilities self-identifying at the university level. Of those, we have had a steep increase in students with psychological disorders. It's really difficult to get some good statistics on the amount of students with psychological disorders self-identifying because many students choose not to identify. But basically, according to the General Accounting Office, they did a report in 2009, and they looked at the changing trends of students with disabilities. And regarding psychological disabilities, in the year 2000, 17.1% of students identified with disabilities had a psychological disability. In 2004, 22.3% had identified as having a psychological disability, and it increased a little bit more to 24.3% in 2008. Other reports have shown up to 30% of students have psychological disorders on campus. And the general feeling and climate on college campuses is that there are large increases in students seeking support for psychological or psychiatric issues. We also see that students with psychological disorders are less likely to complete degrees, may take much longer, but with the proper supports transition, they can be very successful. high school counselors have played a big role in transitioning students, not always as much as we'd like, but they have had a big role and have encouraged parents to take to consider having their high school students look into college, both starting with the 2-year program or in many cases 4-year college. And some of the reasons for the increase are there's less stigma now about psychological disabilities. Students are receiving, or anybody is receiving medications that have less side effects that enable students to interact much more effectively in an academic setting. We're seeing a lot more veterans from the Gulf War, from Afghanistan. Many of the current veterans are coming in with post-traumatic stress disorder and other psychiatric and injuries that are increasing this number. And greater number of students are now seeking treatment. And as part of treatment, they are beginning to identify and receive services through disabilities offices. Post-secondary education really provides a context for positive development of emerging adults. Although students might experience some challenges, there are many, many opportunities for students with mental health disorders at the college level. This is an opportunity for students to begin to explore ideas, opportunities, and different lifestyles, unlike what they've experienced before. They are in the process in their development where they are exploring beliefs and values. They're going to be exposed to people with different religions, political views. They're going to have perspectives about medication, whether or not how they feel about taking medication. They're also going to be exploring different roles such as sexuality and gender identity. And they're seeking various life experiences. Students are exposed to drugs, alcohol, whether we like it or not. They may be exposed to students who are, and to an environment where students are focusing on their health, on their diet, exercise, meditation. So their life is much broader at the college level. Many more opportunities for students
call by phone.
to experience life very differently.
Okay, it's 05.
In addition, this is the time when students are finding out who they are, and so they're testing a lot of different roles and beliefs to ultimately integrate into themselves who they are as a person, as well as separation and individuation. Students are becoming their own person, and it's important to keep that in mind. For students who are emerging adults in post-secondary education, if they are living away from home, this is and even if not, it's an opportunity for them to have a fresh start socially with new friends without the bias of the past. So it's a wonderful opportunity to start anew. When students begin to live away from home, their relationships with their parents and other family members are going to be very different. Previously, the parents have often been in charge and supervised their study, their treatment, scheduled appointments, and now it's important that students take on this responsibility. And often this can be an area of challenge, but it's an opportunity for students to own their challenges and work to manage their life. Also, there's a transition in friendship and support system. They know their friends from secondary school may not be in the area, so they need to start new. And that takes time, and it's an important consideration. They have a fresh start, they can meet new friends, start a new history, and they have to be patient. We also see at the college level, students with psychological disorders often are isolated, and they have a difficulty developing social groups, friendships, and friends. Also, there are going to be changes in mental health services that are available. Students may need to seek out a new therapist, psychiatrist. They may Skype with their previous therapist or doctors, or come home on frequent occasions so that they can have that meeting. But any change in provider creates new challenges to develop a relationship, to feel safe and comfortable with that support person. At the college level, we have different social expectations as well regarding relationships, parties, staying up late, less sleep. With academic demands, there's a lot of less structure. Students don't have exams as frequently. Classes are not held every week, every day of the week. They may have homework assigned in a syllabus for the entire semester, but it may not be collected on a daily basis, so they have to plan that out. And they're going to be experiencing both independent learning without a parent or someone supervising that, as well as experiences where they're working in groups. All of these changes and transitions require planning to make this transition successful. And in looking at that, I think we need to begin by understanding the laws. From kindergarten through high school, we are governed by Individuals with Disabilities in Education Act, which guarantees a free and appropriate public education. At that level, schools identify students, assess them, and provide specially designed instruction in order to help students achieve success at their level. The requirements of the classes may be changed in order for the student to achieve success. Versus at the college level, where we're governed by the Americans with Disabilities Act as amended in 2008 and Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973. These laws protect students from discrimination and provide access to students with disabilities. So at the college level, students need to self-identify. If a professor calls me and says, I think that my student is depressed or their behaviors are such that I have a concern, I cannot reach out to them. They have to come and identify with our Office of Student Disability Services. In addition, it's the student's responsibility to provide documentation, and often that can be expensive. It's not provided by colleges. And any kind of accommodations cannot fundamentally alter the requirements of the course. We can't ask for absences if attendance is required. Students cannot have different kinds of assessments. For instance, write a paper instead of complete multiple choice exams. Students at the college level must be otherwise qualified, so they must be admitted to the university with the same standards as students that have not identified or that are not identified with a disability. Confidentiality changes as well. At the college level, parents no longer have access to student records. Students need to give permission, and that's governed by the Family Educational Rights Privacy Act, or FERPA. So the student is really in control of their information, and that can be a challenge, but it also is an opportunity for students to take responsibility and hopefully allow a member of the family to participate and support that effort. And again, HIPAA is governed for counseling centers, medical student health services that protects student information. So the ADA as amended looks for students for a substantial impact. So a student must have a disability, but it must have a substantial impact on a major life function, such as learning, taking tests, concentrating, thinking. And we're looking at the functional limitations. How does the disorder impact? What are the limitations? And that information helps us determine what might be reasonable accommodations. Although we consider history of medical history and history of receiving accommodations, it's important that we look at the current functioning of a student. Also, previous use of accommodations is an important consideration. What worked, what didn't work. So for students with psychiatric disabilities or any disabilities, the documentation needs to compare them to most people, not compared to the students at their college. They're being compared to most people. A diagnosis of anxiety, generalized anxiety disorder, bipolar disorder, is not enough to receive accommodations. We need information on the symptoms, the severity of the disorder, what is the impact on academics and other major life activities, such as concentrating, thinking, medications, and treatment. And as I mentioned earlier, students must be qualified to be at school. We cannot allow students to have unlimited absences when they need to be in class. In looking at laws around substance abuse, the ADA identifies former addicts as being protected when the addiction may be a substantially limiting impairment. The individual must no longer be engaged in illegal drug use, or they're in a rehabilitation program and not engaged in illegal drug use. And that's really critical. Somebody who's actively using illegal drugs is not eligible for accommodations, is not protected under the ADA. And then regarding confidentiality, federal regulations Title 42, Part 2 requires confidentiality of medical records regarding substance abuse, and there are a few exceptions to that. Okay, when moving right along, my slides are not changing. When we look at documentation guidelines, we're going to look at evaluator qualifications. Do they have experience and training and licensure to treat students that they're diagnosing and treating? Documentation needs to be generally between 6 months to a year. It has to be current because of the changing nature of the disorders, although some are more stable. We need to understand what is the current impact. And the documentation must be comprehensive. It has to include the diagnosis, functional limitations, medications that are being taken, treatment, what's been successful, what's not been successful. So in order to facilitate an effective transition for students, we need to have students be involved in that planning as a high school student. By law, that needs to happen at 16 years of age and sometimes even earlier. But it's really important that parents, despite the fact that it's stressful to let go of, for a parent to let go of the support and managing of the student's disability, the easier they are able to encourage and have their student participate in that process, the more the student will be empowered and will be able to take on the responsibility as they're able. It's really important for students to develop strategies for self-advocacy. They need to be able to communicate their needs to faculty, to counselors, to other people that are providing supports for them. Another critical factor in the success for students with disabilities is self-determination. Students need to know themselves, value themselves, be able to plan, act, and then reflect on what they've done so that they can make changes to, again, move forward in their development. What happens if a student is, it's important for the student to feel that they're in control, that they're empowered, and to own and take responsibility rather than blame others for the challenges. That is a huge step, but a very important step. And as we start to develop a transition plan in the high school, we can help students move slowly towards more independence. And self-determination will help not only in college, but these are life skills, and we really need to encourage our students in this area. Medication is another issue that changes. It's critical that students are communicating with their psychiatrist, that they're scheduling appointments, that they're discussing issues relating to their patterns of sleep, which may change drastically at the college level, and they need to communicate about any, although we don't want them to be using substances, the doctors need to be aware of what they're taking and any changes and needs they may have as a result of their schedules. Students need to develop independence to the level that they're able. So we're not encouraging students to be, the strings to be totally cut, but it's a process, and as the student is able. But it's important for parents and other support personnel to make sure that they are facilitating that transition, because it's going to ultimately help the student be successful. So looking at accommodations, we accommodate students by giving extended time for in-class exams. Sometimes students need a less distracting setting, or they may need a setting all by themselves if there are issues where they may need to speak out loud, where they may have a lot of distractions or movements that might be distracting to others. Students are often use note takers to help them because of impairments in thinking, concentrating, thoughts that might be interfering with them being able to concentrate on the lectures. But we always encourage students to take notes as well as use when they're approved for services of note takers, because part of learning is that it needs to be an active process. And even though you may not be able to gather everything, you are able to really focus in on some of the material that's being learned, and you are processing. In addition, sometimes we provide breaks for students, or if food is needed because of medication issues, that might be accommodation. There are times when students don't really need an accommodation, but they like the disabilities office to send a letter just saying that they've been identified as having a disability but are not receiving any accommodations at this time. And that paves the way for the student to begin to have a conversation with their professor. And then another key area of accommodation is technology. Sometimes students benefit from electronic text where they can listen to their text instead of read, or listen and read at the same time. There's also something called the Smart Pen, which enables students to take notes with permission of the professor. The notes are being taped, and if they miss certain sections, the technology allows them to push on the paper in an area where they missed what was being said, and they can repeat what the professor said over and over until they're clear about what was being said, and then they can take their notes. We do not provide extensions on assignments, alternate formats of exams, or excused absences. We cannot fundamentally change the requirements of a course, and some of these extensions may be provided, but by law, these are things that accommodations may not alter the requirements of the class. Let's look at some of the resources. Disability services will help students review documentation and support students as they transition. They will determine with the student reasonable accommodations and facilitate that process, as well as the use of technology. And those offices will as well provide referrals to other offices on campus. The counseling center is a critical place for students to go, and it's important that students look into these resources before they start college. When they're looking at colleges, they should get a feel for what resources are available at their particular universities. So counseling centers will provide sometimes short-term or longer-term counseling. Sometimes there are psychiatrists available for medication. Other times students need to be referred out to a private therapist or center. Offices of Learning Resources provide valuable tools teaching students learning strategies, time management, project management, exam preparation and taking, learning and memory, strategies for STEM courses, science, math, engineering, and technology courses that teach college-level strategies that students may not have learned for many different reasons, and they can help students plan out how to best, based on their needs, based on their strengths, how to best approach their academics. They also work often with academic reading and writing. Tutoring centers are also critical. We find that, or I encourage students often to anticipate in 2 or 3 weeks that they may need a tutor, and then sign up when they're anticipating that need, because sometimes it takes a while to arrange those services. Then, depending on the different university advisors or particular advising offices in the respective schools that the student are learning in, or dean's offices may be responsible for providing a reduced course load or helping students with registration. In addition, dean's offices and help with social, encouraging students to get involved in activities and organizations, which is really critical for successful transition. Students need to be a whole person. They need to be integrated socially. They need to pursue their own interests in music, sports, social, community service activities that are available on campus. And the RA or housing in the dorm are other critical people to connect with if any kind of housing accommodation is being requested, as well as assistance animals. And finally, career services is essential. So students can communicate with career services for job opportunities, internships, career search, and exploring career options that will best meet the students' needs. So the more that students reach out, even in large universities, and make connections with these and other offices, the more successful, the more resources and supports they're going to have. And one final office that is in most campuses is an office of alcohol and other drugs. And this office monitors alcohol and substance abuse, provides education and support for students around alcohol and drugs. I think that's it for me. Hello? Hello?
Speaking, and I'm
Hello?
Hello?
Hold on now. Hello?
yes, we can hear you, Devin.
Great. Hello, everybody. Sorry about the technical difficulties. I just want to thank Susan. I really appreciate the overview that you just gave us. It really reminded me a lot of what I myself went through when I was in university. Anyway, so just without further ado, my name is Devin Fox. I'm a person in long-term recovery. For me, that means I have a primary diagnosis of a substance use disorder and a secondary diagnosis of a co-occurring mental health condition. So I currently am acting as the executive director of an organization that I founded called Young People in Recovery, which is attempting on a state-by-state basis to make America recovery ready. So we're an advocacy organization that builds chapters of young people in recovery and those that support us, so that we can see physical manifestations of programs for recovery support actually happen and be built within our community itself, so that we stop treating addiction like it's an acute behavioral or criminal problem, and we treat it like it's the chronic condition we know it is. Anyway, so moving on into, that was like an intro, defining recovery. You know, I have a very interesting understanding of what recovery is for me. You know, when I first got into recovery, it was very solid. It was very much like, you know, it needs to be this, it needs to be this at all times, and it can never change. And then I began to grow, and I began to become more of the person that I am today. And I began to understand that as I met other people, that recovery really is something that's defined by the person. You know, my recovery is defined by me. What that means for me is that, you know, I decide on a daily basis to not drink or use drugs. However, there are many different pathways to recovery. You know, recovery is not just this black or white issue. You know, it no longer is a you know, just say no mentality. You know, there's times when we all need to consider the fact that there are many different options to help people get better. So that could be something as simple as your pathway into recovery or your doorway into it, which is, it could be treatment or a 12-step program. That could be, or it could be harm reduction itself. So a lot of aspects of recovery that may be important for an individual, to the individual young person, are you know, their education, their employment, and their housing, and their ability to feel connected to a community. Those four things, especially the first three, the education, the employment, and the housing, we know that when we provide people in recovery in general with those three things, if we increase access to those three things, it makes making the decision to have a life of wellness easier to make. So there's little that I can do to force anybody, any one person, to stay in a process of wellness, to stay in recovery themselves. However, there are many things that we can do to help make that process easier. There's a lot of potential advantages of disclosing to your school or whether or not, you know, you yourself are in recovery, or you yourself have some type of condition, or, you know, some type of life situation that you need accommodations for. And, you know, the advantages are the access to reasonable accommodations. Because once you begin to disclose, to properly disclose, you know, what is happening in your life, you know, to the appropriate people, then the appropriate resources can begin to open up to you. But until you know that you can even do that, nothing probably will happen. There will be legal protection against discrimination. It reduces the stress because the secret does not need to be protected. It reduces stress because the secret does not need to be protected. And there's support in order to be successful, enhances the self-image, as allows self-advocacy. I think, to me, that's one of the most important pieces. When I began to, I went to Rutgers University, and I lived on in the Rutgers Recovery House, which has been there for about 25 years. And I lived there with about 38 other students who were all in recovery from substance use disorder. And you know, as soon as I began to understand that this self-advocacy piece was so important for me as a human being, and I needed to really find my voice and really find out and define what my own personal needs were. And I needed to do the things on a daily basis to get to a spot where I was able to feel as if my needs were met. And that was incredibly important. And you know, and that was a process that, you know, the space that I lived in helped me get to. That's a process that lots of other people began to show me how to do, and slowly but surely I began to take that on as my own. So a lot of potential disadvantages of disclosing. You know, there could be exclusion from a group of said people. There could be stigma attached to disclosing. There could be also trouble with self-image, being seen as needy, and disclosure is difficult, especially when we don't necessarily show people how to do it. There's a difference between me, myself, going out in the world and saying, "Hi, I'm Devin, I'm an addict," to anybody and everyone, because you may or may not be a person who is addicted or has had a problem with addiction. And there is a negative perception on from the public of what an addict is. It may not be for the people that are sitting on this call, but in general, there's just this image that pops into many people's heads of what an addict is and what it looks like and how an addict acts. Now, when I speak out in public about, who I am as I'm Devin Fox, I'm a person in long-term recovery, and then I define for them what that is, it becomes a totally different message. So, a lot of a really important thing, and this is what I say to many people who ask me about different programming things, so a lot of this is training people who are seeking accommodations on how to speak about who they are and what that means. So, disclosure questions. The decision, should I disclose? That's like the #1 question. Is right now the appropriate time and place for me to disclose that something is happening in my life or something has happened in my life, and I may need assistance to be able to continue to move forward. It's a lot of weighing out and balancing out whether or not it's the time. And again, I think it comes depending upon the age of the individual, because we're talking about mainly emerging adults here. Some may need a little bit more assistance than others. It depends. But I think we'd be surprised at how comfortable a lot of young people would be with disclosing who they are, as long as they were given the tools to know how to do it. So if you decide to disclose, who's the appropriate person to tell? And a lot of that, I disclose on a daily basis. I disclose a lot more than most people, simply because of the position I hold and who I am. But some people are only comfortable disclosing with their friends, and and that in and of itself may be appropriate, especially if we are educating the entire community about the resources that are available to them on campus. If the entire community knows about the resources that are available, then if you're only disclosing to your friends, if you disclose to me that, hey, I have a problem with substance use disorder, or hey, I'm an addict, and I'm your friend, and I know that there's these resources that are available for you, then I can maybe say, oh, hey, you know what? There's this department over here that I think will be able to help you. So when should I disclose? How much should I disclose? And what should I disclose? All these questions are key and they're imperative, and they should be asked and they should be weighed out for the appropriateness for the situation, so that the individual stays safe and so that the resources continue to be available. So some of the campus resources available would be like disability services, the counseling centers, the learning resources, tutoring, professors and teaching assistants, advisors, college offices, dean's office, career services. As we all know, campuses are just filled, they're just filled with resources. And I think a lot of times, there's just so much that's available to students that often there's a they have trouble figuring out which resources they may need to, they may not even know that they need them. A lot of social supports, which to me is just another resource. There's clubs and organizations, there's jobs and work study, there's volunteering, faith-based organizations, there's family support, there's peer support. I know when I was in school, feeling a part of something was important to me. Feeling a part of the college recovery community was important to me. I felt like I was part of something that was bigger than myself. It was different than my 12-step meetings. It was part of the campus, and it was something that I could do because I could do things with people. On top of that, when I was encouraged to participate in clubs and organizations outside of the the community that I was living with, that made my life even more stable. I think a lot of peer initiatives are really important. I don't think across the board in the United States that we give enough credit to the to how important and integral peer-to-peer support services are for students in recovery, or I think personally for any student at all. When there's somebody that is being given some type of assistance from a peer in a semi-professional way, it makes it that much easier, I think, for the person to be able to identify what their needs are, and then be able to actually have the tools and feel empowered enough to ask for them. Because we all know that there's many different resources that are available on college campuses. Again, it's all about empowering the students so they know how to get those services and how to utilize them once they receive them. So A lot of different peer initiatives are available and are out in the world. I know Active Minds has many different chapters. They are geared more towards mental health, and they're specifically on college campuses. There's Alcoholics Anonymous, there's Narcotics Anonymous. Actually, most universities that I know have some type of 12-step meeting on campus. You just have to search for them, and you can go to the websites usually and find them. There's Faces and Voices of Recovery, which is also a national advocacy organization. They're a wonderful organization. If you would like to get in contact with Pat Taylor, then you can. They provide a wonderful messaging training for people in recovery and those, and also people who support recovery. And it gives individuals like myself the language that we need to be able to further the cause and continue to expand upon the recovery-oriented systems of care. There's also NAMI on campus. It's the National Association of Mental Illness. There's Young People in Recovery, which is my organization. There's also Youth Move, which is an organization that's dedicated to increasing awareness of youth-related issues on mental illness, on recovery, on cross systems, anything and everything. So here we are with YPR. Again, if you have any other questions, a lot of our updates right now are found on Facebook, so you can follow us on Facebook, facebook.com/youngpeopleinrecovery, or and our new website, www.youngpeopleinrecovery.org, will be launching within the next 2 weeks. And if you have any interest in starting a chapter or learning how to be involved, then you can definitely get in touch with me, and I can put you in touch with some of my staff itself, and we can start making change. So, it really just comes down to empower. I mean, this is my big spiel. It always comes down to empowering the people around you to be part of the process, and even just part of the conversation. Because not all of us are able or capable of doing everything and anything to further any type of cause. However, if you can just be part of the conversation, or you're just an individual who supports, and if there's an event that you can perhaps make, or if there's something that you can do, or you have a kind word that you can give to another person because you know about something else that's happening, then it's all about all that is involved in helping to heal communities. And the problem is, in my opinion, that we continue to see addiction is just becoming, and has been, widespread. And the fact that now, I think it's been reaching a tipping point where white suburbia is finally seeing that a lot of our young people are not only abusing narcotics, but are now dying from the abuse of narcotics. And whether or not that's a good thing, I don't know. But for the movement itself, it's definitely beginning to shed light on the fact that there are things that we need to do on a consistent basis to improve the lives of everybody. So that is about all I have. And I think I'm going to pass it on over to Eileen.
Hello, Susan.
Hi.
There is a question here for you from Kelly. What kinds of accommodations have been successful for students with coping and relationship building issues?
For coping and relationship issues?
Yes.
Well, I think that as opposed to accommodations, that might be working with different key members on campus, or organizations or support services. Accommodations are really providing access to academic or other such settings. Sometimes there are groups within disabilities offices. More frequently, students are coming up or beginning to develop their own peer mentoring programs to support other students with disabilities. As Devin was mentioning, there's an organization, and now it's I'm not remembering the name of it, Devin, that Active Minds on campus, that is a really effective organization that gives students an opportunity to share some similar challenges that they may be having and get peer support, as well as others who are guiding them as they develop relationships. Also, as Devin mentioned, faith-based organizations can be very helpful. Residence halls. But there's not a formal accommodation for developing relationships. Students might talk with a disabilities professional or a counselor on strategies for developing friendships, when, if to disclose to a friend. And one thing I just like to add from earlier, I wanted to make it really clear that when students are approved for accommodations, a letter with the student's permission goes to faculty members indicating that they've identified with a disability. It doesn't give specific details. That information is confidential, which adds another level of safety and protection for students in terms of identifying their specific disorder.
Thank you very much. I have another question that maybe both of you might want to address. Jessica asks, what are the most effective ways to engage students in services?
This is Susan. I would say helping find out what the student's interests are would be a very important first step. Something that they feel good about, comfortable with, that they enjoy doing. That is a beginning step. And critical that students are connecting with, whether it's disabilities office or other supports that can help them identify what organizations or activities might be of interest to the student, and then encouraging them to take the steps to participate in the activities.
Great. Devin, did you have any ideas about that as well? About ways to engage students in services? Oh, I think, yes, we can. Oh, I'm sorry, I think Devin's cut out again. So let me go on and ask a question that several people have asked about problems with absences. If absences cannot be excused as an accommodation, how does a university support students with periodic episodes of disability due to mood disorders or severe social anxiety?
Mm-hmm. That's a very good question. We, as a disability office, can indicate that there is a disability, or that absences may occur, but we cannot mandate that students be allowed to miss more than the course requirements. Students must be qualified to meet the requirements of a course. We cannot change those. And sometimes in conversation with a professor, the student may be able to find a way to manage if they have to miss classes, but it's critical that students who are going to need to miss classes due to appointments, scheduled activities, that they plan their class schedule accordingly, either at a particular time of the day with breaks that will enable them to do what they need to do. And clearly there are times when students are having flares or they're having difficulties, and that's why courses do provide some level of absences, usually 3 classes perhaps a semester, maybe more, or it may not be a requirement of the class. Some schools may be a little bit more flexible in terms of attendance requirements, but by law, the students must be able to complete the requirements of the course.
Great. Well, thank you. There is another related question from Tamara. It's not uncommon for students with mental illness to have slower processing speed and often need extended test-taking time. Most colleges we've worked with have accommodated this. Is this not a right under ADA, or is this a special accommodation some colleges give?
Extended time is the college, the individual college. Any university that's receiving federal funds must follow the ADA and provide access and protect from discrimination. Colleges can determine, specific universities can determine how they, what rises to the level of accommodation, how we determine what's reasonable and what's not. Extended time for exams is something that's given very frequently for students due to the processing issues, whether it the disorder or the medication itself. It would not be so for students taking take-home exams. Students would need to plan their time appropriately so that they can complete those requirements. And that's one of the reasons we have resources such as learning instructors that can work with students and help them find ways of planning and breaking their tasks into smaller chunks and making progress on an ongoing basis. I think the resources are really, that students need to use the resources, the disability services and other, in order to discuss their challenges or their issues and then look at what can be reasonable accommodation and what other supports are out there.
Thank you very much, Susan. I have a couple of questions on family support that I'd like to to open up to you both to answer. Kelly asks, if a parent knows their college-age child has a mental health disability and a history of issues, is there any benefit or even obligation for the parents to try to relay to that school disability office, even if the student doesn't want it disclosed? Very difficult issue.
It is. And we as disability professionals do not have permission to speak with parents about their child, son or daughter, unless that student has provided that permission. At the same time, if there are concerns about safety, there are instances when that information does need to be brought to someone. So clearly, if there's a concern about safety to the student or other people, then it does need to be brought to the attention of somebody. But we cannot provide support to a student who chooses not to request that support.
Well then, I'd like to follow up with a question from Diane, who asks, what does family support look like on campus?
Sure. Just as much as we don't have permission to speak with parents without the student's permission, we can listen, we can talk in general about how procedures and supports, and we can talk about how we can discuss with parents some suggestions about encouraging their students to email as opposed to maybe come in and identify in person, or send a letter, or make a phone call sometimes is a good beginning. To go online and look at what the offices do and what kind of supports are provided. To help for the parent to help understand that there are many students, and sometimes numbers help. It helps for students to know how many students are actually receiving different accommodations. So in general, we can provide information and guidance to parents, but we really need to speak with the student. And sometimes we prefer to speak directly with we have to speak directly with the student, and to talk with the student sometimes, and the parent with the student's permission, can be helpful. So if the parent is able to encourage the student to call together.
Great, thank you very much. I've got one more question that I'd like to close the webinar with, and this is from Chris, who asks, are there any good online resources or checklists to help me prepare better to go to college and find the supports I need? So either Devin or Susan, do you have any ideas about online supports?
Can you, this is Devin. Can you hear me?
Yes, Devin. Please go ahead.
Sure. Right. I think it really, there should be, this is what I would, if somebody said that to me and asked me that, I know this sounds so ridiculous, but if I would really seriously go on Google and look up for a checklist and ask, say, what's the checklist? Is there a checklist available? And if there's not, I would search specifically on your institution's website for a checklist just like that. There's many times on the Residence Life checklist or the Residence Life website or the Counseling Services website or some website, there's a whole list of resources that are available to you on the campus itself. And then I would take that one step further and I would contact that office, whoever they are, and then ask to speak with somebody regarding those, because you want to get specific on what is available. And then also learn what's not available on campus, because although colleges and universities often provide students with a plethora of resources, sometimes there's things that are not available. And or sometimes there's stuff, sometimes they may have a resource that you just don't find appropriate to use on campus and you want to use something else. So I think that the checklist is great, and you should look for that. And you should look on the website itself, but then you should do a little bit of research further.
Okay, thank you very much. And I'd like to thank both of our presenters. And I'd also like to offer a resource form from Pathways Center. Today's slides and references are available at the site indicated below through our Pathways website, but we in the references do have some resources and checklists that students who are preparing to go to college can use to make their experiences more successful. So please just check on our website and under today's webinar, and you'll see a number of links to these kinds of checklists. So if you've got any additional questions or you want to give us some feedback, you can contact myself, Pauline Giovangi or Claudia Selmayr through our email addresses. And then again, please check in at our project website. And then finally, we'd like to acknowledge our funders, the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration and the National Institute for Disability and Rehabilitation Services. This webinar came from Portland State University's Research and Training Center on Pathways to Positive Futures, which is located at our Regional Research Institute for Human Services. Thank you so much for attending today.